Chapter 9 of The Bonnot Gang by Richard Perry. Calm Before the Storm. To be in it is merely a bore, but to be out of it simply a tragedy. Oscar Wilde on Society. Simon Toth. Eli Monnier was in Paris by late evening on March 1st. Rather than skip the country or move to another part of France, he had chosen to come straight to the Lion's Den, to the capital city, which was once again to be the focus of a French social drama. For although Paris housed the headquarters of the Surete and the government, it also served as the operational base of the illegalists. As a thriving cosmopolitan city with well over 1 million inhabitants, it was a natural habitat for those trying to hide from the authorities, especially given the revolutionary and criminal culture character of sections of the Parisian working class. It should be easy enough for Monnier, alias Simon Toth, to hide out in Paris without attracting any undue attention. He spent his first night with René Vallet and Anna Dondon at their rented apartment in Rue Ordinaire. But this was only a temporary measure, as he wished to stay with someone outside the gang's immediate circle. The person he had in mind was Antoine Gauzy, the brother of a friend of his, Louise Gauzy, a supervisor with the Compagnie du Nîmes. The next day, Monnier met up with Pierre Collin, a friend of Laurulot's, and one of the defense witnesses at the 1910 Affray trial, who lived in Maison Alfort, and they went together to Gauzy's shop in Ivry-sur-Seine. It stood just outside the fortifications, only a few hundred meters from the Porte d'Ivry, at 63 Rue de Paris. A sky-blue second-hand clothes shop bearing the sign Le Hale Populaire d'Ivry. Antoine was a middle-aged anarchist who lived above the shop with his wife and 2 young children, the younger of whom they had named Germinal after Émile Zola's novel of the same name. Gauzy remembered the young man from when they'd first met 3 years ago in Nîmes. He was very glad to see a fellow Southerner, and agreed to put him up if he could help out in the shop. He introduced him to a close friend, Pierre Cardi, a 36-year-old Corsican who ran a similar shop across the river in Alfortville. Painted in the same sky blue, the Draperie cum Fancy Goods shop bore the legend Au Soldier Populaire over the door, and was mainly run by 2 women, Cardi's lover, Marie, who was Pierre Collin's sister, and her 17-year-old friend, Marie Besset. It was the latter who the press later described as petite, brown-haired, well-dressed, and coiffured, but with the hands of a domestic servant, who soon fell to the charms of the dark-skinned, handsome, mustachioed anarchist of the Midi. So Monnier had experienced little difficulty in getting a place to stay, some regular work, and a young lover. He even dined out in Montmartre with Laurelot and Jean Bellardi, despite the risks. If the gang needed him, they knew where he was, but for the time being he was a sleeper, who would awaken when they called him. The daily papers informed him of the arrest, in Alais, of Paul Sazy and his girlfriend on March 5th, but admitted that the police had no leads on the whereabouts of the sender of the telegram. The Surete had not paid much attention to a letter from a certain Madame Y, dated 30th of January, who said that her husband had been asked to hide the bandits, who were 2 second-hand clothes dealers named Cardi and Gauzy. Of human bondage. At the same time as Lapine was preaching over the grave of the dead policeman, and Monnier was sitting in the third-class railway carriage rolling north towards Paris, Bonnot was secretly meeting his 2 old associates in crime from Lyon in the Bois de Boulogne. Neither Bonnot nor Garnier had been too happy about leaving the bonds with Vanderburg in Amsterdam, especially as he couldn't seem to sell them. There were 50,000 francs worth of Turkish, Nordsud, and Ville de Paris transferable securities. They were hot properties, sure, but even a 10% return would give them almost as much as they'd seized in cash from the Rue Ordinaire, and they needed the money now, not later. Bonnot and Garnier arranged a series of meetings in the Bois de Vincennes during February with David Belloni, and Alphonse Rodriguez to discuss the retrieval of the bonds and the assignation of a reliable receiver in Paris. As it turned out, Bonnot contacted none other than Pierre Cardi from Alfontville and took the opportunity to speak to Monnier and Gauzy. Cardi knew several fences in this line of business. It was he who had introduced Edward Carroy to the two young men, Pancrazi and Crozat de Fleury, who were currently engaged in negotiating checks stolen from the burglary at Thiais. For a large amount such as this, Cardi suggested Georges Taquard, alias Le Juif, aka L'Algérien, aka Le Usurier, who had enough funds to speculate on the bourse, the stock exchange. Unfortunately for the gang, Le Juif said that he could not possibly give them more than 5% of the total value, given the extreme riskiness of trying to negotiate them. Jules, Octave, and Raymond were rather sulkily forced to accept, as there were no better offers on the horizon. So it was that Bonnot met up with Belloni and Rodriguez in the Bois de Boulogne on Friday, March 1st, and informed them that they should go to Amsterdam to get the bonds, and meet back in Paris at 7 the following Thursday evening at the Nation metro station. David Belloni went back to an insalubrious little hotel in Rue Joy Rouvre, Belleville, where he was staying under the name of Monsieur Bruyol. During February, he'd been living in Sotteville, just outside Rouen. Alphonse was going back to Lille for the weekend, where he had rented a place since the previous July with his lover, Anne Lecault, a fancy leather goods worker. Before that, he'd been serving a prison sentence for forgery in HMP Dartmoor. On his release, he'd returned to France, settled in Lille, been expelled from Belgium, and taken up his old profession as a peddler come forger of 10-franc pieces. It is not known when the gang contacted him in Lille before his arrival in Paris on January 18th, when Belloni had checked him into a grotty hotel in the Rue Ballon, near Barbe, in the name of Monsieur Lecault. On Tuesday, March 5th, Belloni and Rodriguez took a train to Amsterdam and retrieved the bonds from Vandenberg. Returning the next day, they deposited the package containing the goodies in the left luggage office at the Gare du Nord and went to their respective hotels. The next evening, they met Bonnot as planned in the metro station and went together in Godorowski's flat at 6 Rue Courtot, just behind the Sacre-Cœur, where Garnier and Calaman were waiting. They discussed the arrangements for meeting Taquard in the Café Marcel the following Sunday. Taquard was expecting to meet only with Belloni and Rodriguez, but in fact, Bonnot, Garnier, Calaman, and René Vallée were all to be there at nearby tables to keep an eye on things. If they'd been betrayed to the police when Le Juif would certainly not escape with his life. The police were not entirely wrong when they said they were looking for a gang who plotted their coups on the Boulevard de Clichy, for Café Marcel at 54 on the Boulevard Rochechouart stood on a street that was simply the continuation of the former. Taquard sat at the table with two go-betweens apparently unaware that every action was being watched by other members of the gang. He explained to Belloni that he'd had a very poor day at the Bourse the day before, and hadn't been in a position to sell shares sufficient to raise the agreed 2,500 francs. However, he did have 500 francs, and he could get the balance the following day. Belloni was not particularly impressed with the explanation. He said he would take the 500 francs in exchange for 1/5 of the bonds, and meet him the following day to finalize the transaction. Belloni and Rodriguez then left first, followed a few minutes later by Taquard, and then the rest of the gang. Belloni and Rodriguez strolled down to the Gare du Nord and left the package in the consigne, then walked back through Montmartre, up the steep slope of La Butte to Rue Courtot. After sharing out the proceeds, Belloni and Rodriguez made their way back to their respective hotels. Around 10 o'clock the next morning, David Belloni left his room in Belleville and went to retrieve the package from the left luggage office.
But no sooner did he have the package in his hands than he was seized by several detectives. Under questioning, he refused to give his name and said that the package had been left in the safekeeping by Charles, whom he'd met in a cafe on the Boulevard Clichy, and knew his companion only as Roger. He did admit knowing Bonnot from Lyon, but that was not in itself a crime. Belloni knew that if the others had not heard from him by the end of the day, they would surely realize something was wrong. As it was, the police were being incredibly inefficient. For not only did they not raid Rue Courtois, but they even let Rodriguez slip out of his hotel unnoticed. All they found of any interest were some false collars of Dutch make, exactly the same as worn by Dudon and Debeau. They had more luck, however, searching Belloni's room in the Rue Joy roof, where they discovered some letters that had rather stupidly not been destroyed. They were from Rodriguez and gave his address in Lille. As Anna and Alphonse were sleeping peacefully in their room in the Rue de Barbier May that night, the street outside was already alive with the movement of police from the Brigade Mobile, disguised as stonemasons. An inspector from the Surete had arrived at midnight with a warrant for Rodriguez's arrest and proceeded to direct operations. One detective was dressed as a painter and pretended to be cleaning the facade, while another four were sent to occupy the owner's dining room after he had awoken. Rodriguez slept late that morning, but finally clambered down the stairs at 11 o'clock. From the dining room burst the four cops and a violent struggle ensued, but Rodriguez was no match for the four burly detectives. Although he did try to make a break for it in the street, he protested his innocence and gave the name Ferdinand Delgado, 33 years old, born in Buenos Aires. Upstairs in his room, they found Anna, who of course was arrested. But more significantly, they discovered letters whose content directly implicated Rodriguez in the affairs of the auto bandits. Gang members and their meeting places were mentioned, and as if they were not enough, the police also took a strong suitcase containing pliers, files, burglars' tools, instruments for forging coins, as well as lead, antimony, ammonia, and imitation 10 franc pieces ready to be gilded. On the Wednesday morning, the national press gave details of both arrests, such that when Rodriguez arrived at the Gare du Nord on the Thursday, a large crowd gathered chanting, "A mort, a mort," death, death. The police put out the story that they'd first spotted Belloni and Rodriguez in the Gare du Nord on the Saturday, their suspicions being aroused because they observed that neither had a ticket for traveling when they'd left the package in the consigne. On inspection, detectives were said to have found it contained the bonds stolen in the Rue Ordinaire robbery. To further substantiate their story, the police said that they had a tip-off from their Dutch counterparts to watch the left luggage office of the main railway stations. But if this was all true, why was there no raid in Rue Courtois? Why were Belloni and Rodriguez not arrested on the Sunday evening? What happened to Tacard? How was Rodriguez allowed to escape from his hotel in the Rue Bellon? In fact, the whole operation was riddled with unanswered questions. Tacard was not an anarchist, though he was a well-known fence in the Montmartre underworld. For him, the other criminals, the activities of these anarcho-bandits was a hindrance to their usual criminal activities, given that Paris was now swarming with police on the lookout for anything suspicious. It is quite likely that he grassed up Belloni and Rodriguez to the police, either on the Sunday evening or before. If the police were only informed on Sunday evening, then they would explain why Belloni was only arrested on Monday morning, as he tried to retrieve the package at the Gare du Nord. It would further explain why Rodriguez slipped out of Rue Bellhomme unobserved, and why Rue Courtois was not raided, because the police had not spotted Belloni and Rodriguez on the Saturday, and had consequently not tailed anybody in Rue Courtois. Tacard, of course, was completely unaware of its existence as Bonnot and Garnier's current hideout. The only other puzzling thing in the conspicuous absence of Juin, the vice chief of the Surete, in this operation, He had personally supervised the surveillance of Dudon in February, but he had not gone to LA in search of Simantov, nor had he been present at the arrests of Bonnot and Rodriguez. In fact, Louis Jouin had disagreed so violently with the Gouchard over his order to arrest Dudon that the two men had hardly been speaking to each other since. Previously, the actual conduct of operations had been Jouin's responsibility, but now he'd virtually washed his hands of the entire investigation and left his inspectors in charge. He was sure that only patient, unobtrusive surveillance could lead them to the ringleaders of the gang, while premature arrest could jeopardize the whole operation. And indeed, he was right, for the police were not even closer this time, though they did not know it, than they had been when watching Rue Nolette. The result was that Bonnot, Garnier, and Calaman escaped for a second time. Gouchard, however, was still smarting from the dressing down he'd received at the hands of Lapine, the prefect of police, and while the incident at the Place de Havre was still fresh in public memory, he was determined to continue the policy of making immediate arrests. In this way, he could maintain his self esteem in front of his superiors and stave off criticism from the press. His only problem was that the gun-toting, mustachioed attacker of the Rue Ordinaire was not yet behind bars, or was he? Dudon in the hot seat. Whereas David Bologna had very little under interrogation by detectives and the examining magistrate, Monsieur Gilbert Rodriguez made a full confession. It was not difficult for Gouchard to put pressure on him. He had 10 previous convictions, and this time he was facing probable transportation to Devil's Island if found guilty. At this time of life, this could quite easily be a death sentence. Rodriguez was not stupid. He realized that even a full confession could not add much to what the police already knew. So he went further in cooperating with them and told the police what they wanted to hear. He'd heard from Bonnot that Dudon was involved in the Rue Ordinaire holdup. Eugene Dudon already had a few awkward questions to answer. For a start, he'd been found in Fiat previously occupied by Bologna and Bonnot, in which they had found those Dutch-made collars and cuffs, which were exactly the same as found in Bologna's hotel room. There was also the left luggage ticket found on him, which produced the pigskin medical briefcase, stolen from Gent in January. Then there was the matter of the 2 telegrams, one saying, "We anxiously await you. Come at once, Raymond," sent 2 days before the Rue Ordinaire holdup. The other reading, "Our mother in good health," sent from Alais the same day as the policeman was killed at the Place de Havre. Lastly, there was the matter of the automatic pistol found in his possession. All in all, enough circumstantial evidence to suggest a continuous involvement with the gang, but not enough to prove that he had played any part in the actual robberies or burglaries themselves. Eugene was aware of the tricky position he was in, but as a good comrade preferred not to say anything that might implicate his friends. Even threats against Louise left him unmoved. Gouchard now playing his trump card and wheeled on his star witness, the bank messenger, Monsieur Cabby. Rather than identify parade, Rather than an identity parade, Gouchard arranged for a confrontation in which the witness was shown into an interview room in which the handcuffed defendant was already seated. Dudon could hardly believe his ears when Cabby began shouting that he, Eugene, was the man who had shot him in Rue Ordinaire. Cabby had already identified Courroy and then Garnier as his attackers from photographs, but now declared that he'd been mistaken and swore that this was the man responsible. Dudon hardly knew what to say except that Cabby had made a terrible error. Why, he had not even been in Paris at the time. He even had witnesses who could vouch for the fact that they had been with him in Nancy that very same day. Gouchard ignored Dudon's alibi. Doubtless all his witnesses were anarchists, who would say anything to save a comrade. Gouchard had what he wanted, a palliative to serve up to the press. the public, and his superiors. Within 2 weeks of the outrage at Place de Havre, he had effected 4 important arrests, including that of the principal robber of Rue Ordinaire. So long as Bonnot and Garnier lay low until their eventual arrest, not far off now, surely, then he and the Surete as a whole might be saved further embarrassment. To counter Rodriguez's assertion, David Belloni straightway declared that Garnier had told him that Dudon had played no part in the Rue Ordinaire robbery. But his words did not carry much weight in the face of Cabby's identification. Louise was extremely shocked by this unexpected development and immediately raced over to Nancy to try to find witnesses who could support her husband's alibi. But she was increasingly worried that Eugene would go to prison for a long time simply out of solidarity with the others. She announced publicly that she was considering talking to the police. To avoid the possibility, Dudon was left with no choice but to say that he himself would talk in the hope that the comrades on the outside would do something to attest his innocence. On the Tuesday, the next day, the Dallies all carried the same headline: Dudon will talk in 48 hours.
Garnier's challenge. The gang had been somewhat in the doldrums since the arrest of Bologna and Rodriguez. They'd only got a few hundred francs from the sale of the bonds, which was perhaps only to be expected. They should never have trusted Tocard anyway. He was not a comrade nor even an anarchist. But then again, there were plenty of comrades in the milieu who could not be relied upon, given the vitriol that had been flung at them in a recent article in L'Anarchie. The author of the piece, who had signed himself L.A., had ridiculed them as feeble, narrow-minded simpletons who wanted to be strong men, lazy, non-working thieves, whose theories were a load of twaddle. Their lives would be short, but in the meantime it was necessary for the rest of the milieu to part company with them. Of course, there had been a spirited reply the following week by Victor Merrick, which concluded by appealing for more money for the new prisoners. And the previous month, 300 people had attended a causerie populaire in support of Les Anards contre la Loi. Nevertheless, overall, they were more and more isolated and shunned by their comrades. The gang had abandoned Rue Courtot, and were now staying with René Vellet and Anna Dondon in the flat in Rue Ordinaire, of all places. Godorowski had given up his job as a typographer at the Hotel de Ville and disappeared. The gang hadn't really had any successes since their first trip to Ghent in January. Their second had been a fiasco. The LA job had been aborted, and they'd almost got shot in Pontoise. Still, they had killed a cop, if nothing else. But to top it all, that miserable little bank clerk had identified Dudon, doubtless another of Gouchard's tricks. Bonnot and Garnier had been collecting newspaper cuttings about their opponents, in case they one day soon came face to face. Eugene and Louise's declaration that they would soon talk meant that something had to be done, and for Garnier that meant something spectacular. He would write a letter to the press exonerating Dudon and ridiculing the police, and emphasize that they were still in business, by making an even more daring attack on society. The papers said that Dudon would talk in 48 hours. That meant the letter had to be posted that day. He composed it in the afternoon, then hurried down to Rue de Louvre, right in the heart of the capital, to post it. Le Matin received it the next morning and published it in full on the front page the day after that. It read as follows: Paris, March 19, 1912, 4:25 p.m. Monsieur the Editor, would you please insert the following: to Messrs. Gilbert, Gouchard, and Co. From the time that the press has, through your intervention, put my modest personage into the limelight, you have, to the great joy of the concierges in the capital, been announcing my capture as imminent. Hut, believe me, all this noise won't stop me from tasting all the joys of life and peace. As you have definitely admitted at different times, it's not due to your intelligence that you were able to pick up my trail again, but thanks to a grass who got in amongst us. Be convinced of one thing: me and my friends will know how to give him and a few other talkative witnesses their just deserts. And your 10,000 franc bounty, offered to my companion to betray me. What a trifling sum for you who are so lavish with the state's money. Multiply the sum by 10, messieurs, and I will surrender myself to your mercy, bound hand and foot, lock, stock, and barrel. I swear your inability for the noble offices you exercise is so obvious that a few days ago I had a mind to present myself at your offices in order to give you some fuller information and correct a few of your errors, whether intentional or not. I declare to Don to be innocent of the crime that you know full well I committed. I refute Rodriguez's allegations. I alone am guilty. And don't think I'm going to run away from you, your police, on my word. I believe they're the ones who are afraid. I know there will be an end to this struggle which has begun between me and the formidable arsenal at society's disposal. I know that I will be beaten. I am the weakest, but I sincerely hope to make you pay dearly for your victory. Awaiting the pleasure of meeting you, Garnier. Another sheet of paper bore Garnier's finger and right hand prints, and scrawled below, Bertillon, you nutter, bung on your glasses and watch out. Another letter sent to Gauchard in person suggested a rendezvous outside a cinema in the Rue des Pyrènes, but Garnier failed to turn up. Bonnot, however, was not to be outdone in this display of bravado. He walked into the offices of the Petit Parisien, another popular daily, and complained to a journalist, Charles Sourwine, about one of the stories they'd run. Bonnot placed his Browning automatic on the table as the journalist noted down his challenge, which was published in the next day's edition. We'll burn off our last round against the cops, and if they don't care to come, we'll certainly know how to find them. Bonnot then picked up his gun and left. Of course, it would have been against journalistic ethics to have called the police, partly out of respect for the pair's audacity, and partly out of a political come general hostility to the police. Certain sections of the press began to call them the tragic bandits, while Le Petit Parisien stuck with the Bonnot gang. Back in '96, Rue Ordinaire, the gang were preparing the next coup. As usual, Garnier was the motivating force, determined to carry out an even more daring robbery, although not without some prior planning. For a start, he was determined to use more powerful weapons, and he bought no less than 4 Winchester repeating rifles from André Poyer. This would give them even more of an edge over the police, who were armed only with heavy old cavalry revolvers. René Valet and Anna had already cased a suitable bank in a town far enough away from Paris not to be affected by the hysterical bandit paranoia, which had swept through the local bourgeoisie like a contagious disease. Garnier decided that they should steal a car on the day his letter was published and attack the bank the following morning, a Friday, and this time there would be more of them. René Valet was eager to join in the struggle, and had also asked at André's own request that Saudi should be allowed to come along. Monnier would join them from Ivry. Neither Garnier nor Bonnot were satisfied that young tuberculosis Saudi was on the right mettle to enter their desperate struggle. But René's intercession made them give way, and after all, they needed all the help they could get. Still, for the purposes of stealing the car, it would just be the old trio, Jules, Raymond, and Octave. While Raymond kept a lookout, Bonnot and Garnier went to try and force their way into the garage of a bourgeois house in Rue d'Apermachil, in the quiet village of Chateau, west of Paris. What with the bandit alert, it was more risky and difficult to burgle places now, with people on the lookout and doors double and triple locked. A dog began barking as they were at the garage doors, and woke up the chauffeur, who immediately seized a pistol and began shooting. Garnier shone the torch in his face and fired off a few rounds before he and Bonnot made off. The three of them got back to Paris safely, but it was another setback. Maybe there was an easier way of stealing a car. The incident was reported the next day, but bandit scare stories took second place to the continuing saga of the taxi driver strike, now in its 17th week, since the bomb attacks by strikers hit squads on scab taxis. The scabs, many of whom were specially imported Corsicans with scant knowledge of the Paris streets, had begun organizing attacks on union officials, doubtless with the blessing of the company and the police, who generally turned a blind eye to such righteous-to-work anger. However, things got out of hand on the Saturday evening when a striker named Bedon was shot down by a scab after leaving a meeting. The police failed to apprehend the culprit. The next day, a Sunday, the gang learned that Rirette had been rearrested for the last time, charged with receiving stolen weapons, and sent to the women's prison of Saint Lazare. Paul Sazy had been brought to Paris for further questioning, and Rodriguez had tried to hang himself in his cell. In the streets, taxi drivers began fly posting posters proclaiming Lapine, chief of the murderers, and handed out leaflets calling for a mass demonstration demanding that Baron be avenged. For the illegalists, it was time to set to work.